The village of Millbrook had always been a place where old superstitions died hard, clinging to the consciousness of its inhabitants like morning fog to the valley floor. Nestled in the Appalachian foothills, it was the kind of town where 3 generations might live under one roof, where recipes were handed down like heirlooms, and where the church bells on Sunday morning were answered by every household within earshot. Father Marcus had served St. Catherine's Parish for nearly 30 years, and in all that time, he had never seen a baby go unbaptized for more than a few weeks after birth. It simply wasn't done. The ceremony was scheduled before the child even entered the world. Grandmothers hovering over pregnant daughters with dates circled on calendars, godparents selected with the gravity of choosing a guardian for royalty. But that autumn, something had changed in Millbrook, and Father Marcus felt it in his bones like the approach of a winter storm. It began with Sarah Winters, a young woman who had moved to Millbrook from Seattle 3 years prior with her husband, Derek, a software engineer who worked remotely from their restored farmhouse on the edge of town. Sarah had given birth to a healthy boy in late September, and when Father Marcus stopped by with a basket of provisions and to discuss the baptism, Sarah had smiled politely and told him they were considering a humanist naming ceremony instead. She spoke of wanting their son, Henry, to choose his own path when he was old enough to understand. Father Marcus had left feeling unsettled, not out of judgment, but because of something he couldn't quite name, an instinct honed by decades of pastoral care. Then came the Johnsons, a family that had attended St. Catherine's irregularly, who simply kept postponing their daughter's baptism due to scheduling conflicts. By mid-October, there were 4 unbaptized infants in Millbrook, and that was when the killings started. The first was a fox, or what remained of one, found in the Winters' yard on a Tuesday morning. Sarah had stepped onto her porch with baby Henry in her arms, intending to enjoy the crisp autumn air, when she saw the carnage spread across her lawn. The animal had been torn apart with such violence that its body was barely recognizable. Entrails strewn in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, almost ritualistic. Derek had cleaned it up quickly, before Sarah could see too much, attributing it to coyotes, or perhaps a large dog, though he'd noticed the strange tracks in the soft earth near the tree line. Tracks that seemed to begin as canine and shift into something resembling human feet. Barefoot impressions pressed deep into the soil. He didn't mention this to Sarah, who was already exhausted from sleepless nights with a newborn. He told himself it was a trick of the light, the way the morning dew had pooled in the depressions, distorting their shape. 3 nights later, the Hendersons' dog disappeared. Max was a German shepherd, protective and well-trained, who slept in the backyard inside a sturdy doghouse. Emily Henderson woke to his barking around 2 in the morning, a frantic, terrified sound she'd never heard him make before. By the time she'd roused her husband Paul and they'd reached the window, the barking had stopped. In the morning, they found the chain broken, torn apart as if it were made of paper, and a trail of blood leading into the woods. They never found Max's body. Emily clutched their 3-week-old daughter. Grace tighter that day, an unnamed fear, taking root in her chest. She mentioned to her neighbor that they'd been meaning to schedule Grace's baptism, that Paul's mother had been asking about it. But with the baby's colic and Paul's long hours at the factory, they just hadn't gotten around to it. The neighbor, Mrs. Chun, an elderly woman whose family had been in Millbrook for 5 generations, went pale at this news and urged Emily to call Father Marcus immediately. There was something in Mrs. Chun's eyes, an ancient worry that made Emily's blood run cold. Father Marcus received 4 phone calls that week from families suddenly urgent about baptismal dates. He accommodated them all, moving other obligations, sensing that this was somehow important beyond the normal rhythms of parish life. But the Winters family didn't call, and neither did the Johnsons. Sarah had mentioned to a friend at the grocery store that they were going to wait until spring, maybe have an outdoor celebration when the weather was nice. The friend had tried to hide her alarm, but Sarah noticed and felt defensive, modernity clashing with tradition in the aisles between organic produce and locally sourced honey. That night, while Derek worked late in his home office, and Sarah slept fitfully upstairs with Henry in his bassinet beside her bed, something moved through the woods surrounding their property. Until spring, maybe have an outdoor celebration when the weather was nice. The friend had tried to hide her alarm, but Sarah noticed and felt defensive. Modernity clashing with tradition in the aisles between organic produce and locally sourced honey. That night, while Derek worked late in his home office and Sarah slept fitfully upstairs with Henry in his bassinet beside her bed. Something moved through the woods surrounding their property. Old Thomas Garrett saw it. Thomas lived alone in a cabin a quarter-mile from the Winters' place, a widower who supplemented his pension by hunting and gathering ginseng in the mountains. He'd been sitting on his porch, unable to sleep, drinking whiskey and watching the moon rise over the ridge, when he saw the figure emerge from the tree line. At first, he thought it was a large dog, perhaps a wolf, though wolves hadn't been seen in these parts for 100 years. But as it moved into the moonlight, Thomas's hand froze with the glass halfway to his lips. The creature walked on 4 legs, but its gait was wrong. Too intelligent, too purposeful. Its body was covered in coarse, dark fur, but the musculature underneath suggested something humanoid, powerful shoulders and a torso that seemed too long, too flexible. And then it stopped and raised its head, scenting the air, and Thomas saw its face. It was the face of something caught between wolf and man, neither one nor the other. A snout that still held the structure of a human nose and jaw. Eyes that reflected the moonlight with an amber glow that held too much awareness, too much hunger. Thomas dropped his glass, and the sound of shattering crystal caused the creature to turn its head toward him. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance, and Thomas felt the recognition there, felt certain that whatever this thing was, it had once been human, might still be human in some cursed way. Then it turned back toward the Winters farmhouse and continued moving, silent as smoke, until it disappeared into the shadows near their barn. Thomas grabbed his rifle and his phone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely dial. He called Sheriff Brennan, a practical man, who Thomas expected to be skeptical. But the sheriff's voice was tight when he answered, and he told Thomas to stay inside, lock his doors, and keep his gun close. The sheriff would come by in the morning. Thomas wanted to call the Winters directly, to warn them, but he realized he didn't have their number, and directory assistance seemed impossibly complicated in his panicked state. Instead, he barricaded himself inside his cabin and watched through the window until dawn, his rifle across his lap, seeing shadows where there might be none, hearing sounds that could be wind, or could be something circling his property. When the sun finally rose, Thomas felt exhausted and foolish, wondering if the whiskey had been playing tricks on him. But then he saw the tracks in his yard, the same tracks Derek Winters had seen, canine shifting to human, pressed deep into the earth with the weight of something massive. Sheriff Brennan arrived at Thomas's cabin at 8 in the morning with Deputy Collins, a young woman who'd grown up in Millbrook and returned after college with a degree in criminal justice and a determination to bring modern policing to their community. Thomas showed them the tracks and watched Deputy Collins's skeptical expression shift to confusion as she examined them, taking photographs, making measurements. Sheriff Brennan was quiet, his weathered face unreadable, but Thomas could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hand rested on his service weapon. They went to the Winters house together and found Sarah on the porch with Henry, enjoying the morning sun, completely unaware that anything unusual had happened. Derek was inside on a conference call, his voice drifting through the open window as he discussed quarterly projections with colleagues in California. The sheriff asked if they'd seen or heard anything unusual during the night, and Sarah said no. Everything had been quiet. Henry had actually slept for 5 hours straight for the first time since coming home from the hospital. But when they walked around the property, they found more tracks, circling the house, pausing beneath Henry's window. Long scratches in the wood siding that looked like they'd been made by claws the size of fingers. Derek ended his call and came outside, and the sheriff's questions became more pointed. Had they made enemies in town? Were there any disputes with neighbors? Derek and Sarah exchanged glances, puzzled, and said no. Everyone had been welcoming, maybe a bit nosy in that small-town way, but friendly. The sheriff hesitated, then asked about Henry's baptism, and Sarah's expression cooled. She said they'd made their decision about that, and she didn't appreciate the implication that it was anyone's business but their own. Derek put a protective arm around her, and Sheriff Brennan raised his hands in a placating gesture, saying he wasn't judging. But there had been some unusual incidents in town, and he needed them to be vigilant, to keep their doors locked, to call immediately if they saw anything strange. He didn't mention what Thomas had seen, didn't want to sound like he believed in monsters, but his earnestness was enough to frighten Sarah, who took Henry back inside and locked the door behind her. Father Marcus learned about the sheriff's visit from Deputy Collins, who stopped by the rectory that afternoon looking troubled. She'd grown up hearing her grandmother's stories about the old beliefs, things that existed before Christianity came to these mountains, things that the church had tried to bury but never quite succeeded in. Her grandmother had spoken of the werewolf, not in the Hollywood sense of a full moon transformation and silver bullets, but as something older, something that was drawn to the unbaptized. 2 infants who hadn't been claimed by the church, who existed in a liminal space between the sacred and the profane. In the old stories, baptism was protection, a seal that marked a child as under God's care, but an unbaptized baby was vulnerable, undefended against the things that moved in darkness. Deputy Collins had dismissed these stories as folklore, remnants of a time when infant mortality was high and people needed explanations for tragedies they couldn't prevent. But now, looking at those tracks, remembering the fear in Thomas Garrett's eyes, she wasn't so sure. Father Marcus listened carefully, and when she finished, he was silent for a long moment. Finally, he told her about the old texts in the parish archives, records that went back to the founding of St. Catherine's in 1847. There were accounts from that era, carefully worded, that spoke of similar incidents. Livestock killed, families terrorized, and always, at the center, an unbaptized child. The attacks would continue until the child was either baptized or taken. Father Marcus had read these accounts years ago, had filed them away as historical curiosities, examples of how superstition could grip a community in times of fear. But now, he found himself remembering details, the careful instructions left by his predecessors about how to handle such situations, the prayers that weren't quite standard Catholic liturgy, older invocations that seemed to predate the church's arrival in these mountains. He told Deputy Collins that he would speak to Sarah and Derek again, that he would make them understand this wasn't about religious dogma, it was about keeping their sons safe. But that night, before Father Marcus could make his visit, the creature came again to the Winters farmhouse. Sarah woke to Henry's crying, that newborn wail that cut through sleep like a knife. And as she reached for him in the darkness, she heard something else, a scratching at the window, rhythmic and deliberate. She froze, her hand on Henry's warm body, feeling his small chest rise and fall beneath her palm. The scratching continued, and then came a sound that would haunt her for the rest of her life. A low, rumbling growl that held an almost human quality, as if something was trying to form words but couldn't quite manage it. Sarah grabbed Henry and ran for the hallway, screaming for Derek. And behind her, she heard glass shattering, heard something large forcing its way through the window frame. Derek burst from his office and saw Sarah running toward him with the baby, saw the terror on her face, and behind her, framed in the doorway of their bedroom, he saw it. The creature filled the doorframe, hunched but still massive, fur matted and dark, catching the nightlight's glow. Its eyes found Henry, fixed on the bundle in Sarah's arms with an intensity that was unmistakably predatory. Derek did the only thing he could think of. He charged at it, yelling, trying to draw its attention away from his wife and son. The creature turned its gaze to him, and Derek saw intelligence there, calculation, and then it moved with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. It batted Derek aside almost casually, sending him crashing into the wall, and then it advanced on Sarah, who had backed into the corner of the hallway, clutching Henry against her chest, her body the only shield between her baby and this nightmare. The creature reached out with one massive clawed hand, and Sarah closed her eyes, certain these were her last moments, when suddenly the front door exploded inward and Thomas Garrett was there, rifle raised, and the blast of gunfire in the enclosed space was deafening. The creature roared, a sound of pain and rage, and turned toward this new threat. Thomas fired again, and the creature lunged toward him. But instead of attacking, it burst past him and out the open door, disappearing into the night with a speed that left Thomas staring after it in disbelief. He'd hit it, twice, center mass, shots that should have dropped any animal, but it had barely slowed down. Derek struggled to his feet, blood running from a cut on his forehead where he'd hit the wall, and Sarah was sobbing, checking Henry desperately for any injury, finding none. The baby was wailing, terrified by the chaos, but alive, untouched. Thomas stood in the doorway, his rifle still raised, and told them that they needed to leave. Now, tonight, or they needed to get that baby baptized before dawn. Sarah looked at him with wild eyes and said they would do it anything. Whatever it took, just please keep them safe. Father Marcus received a call at 3 in the morning and arrived at St. Catherine's to find the Winters family, Thomas Garrett, Sheriff Brennan, and Deputy Collins, all waiting on the steps. The church was cold and dark, but Marcus moved through it with practiced efficiency, turning on lights, gathering what he needed for the sacrament. Sarah held Henry wrapped in blankets, and Derek had his arm around her, both of them looking shaken and exhausted. Marcus didn't ask for explanations. He could see the truth in their faces, in the way they kept glancing toward the darkness beyond the church's lit windows. He filled the baptismal font with blessed water, lit the candles, and began the ceremony. His voice was steady as he spoke the ancient words. Words that had been said over countless children through countless generations. Words that claimed this infant as part of the community of faith, that marked him as protected, as belonging. When Marcus poured the water over Henry's forehead, the baby stopped crying, his dark eyes seeming to focus on the priest's face with an awareness beyond his few weeks of life. Marcus anointed him with chrism oil, made the sign of the cross on his small forehead, and declared him baptized in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Sarah wept with relief, and Derek held them both. And Thomas Garrett bowed his head and whispered a prayer his own grandmother had taught him. Older than the church, older than memory. They spent the rest of the night in the church, no one willing to risk the journey home in darkness. As dawn approached, Sheriff Brennan organized a search of the woods surrounding the Winters property, taking deputies and volunteers who he'd sworn to secrecy. They found blood on the leaves where Thomas had shot the creature, a trail that led deep into the forest before simply ending, as if whatever it was had vanished into thin air or had recovered enough to hide its tracks. They found a cave, far up in the hills, with signs that something large had been denning there. More blood, scraps of fur, and scratched on the cave wall in letters that looked like they'd been made with claws. A single word, unbaptized. The sheriff photographed it, documented it, and then had the cave entrance collapsed with explosives, sealing whatever had been inside, or at least making it harder for it to emerge again. The Johnsons had their daughter baptized that same Sunday, a quick, quiet ceremony with only family present. Within a month, every infant in Millbrook had been baptized, and Father Marcus found himself being called to neighboring towns, two communities where the old stories were still remembered, where parents looked at their children and decided that tradition might carry more wisdom than they'd previously believed. The Winters family stayed in Millbrook, though they moved into town proper, selling the farmhouse to a young couple without children who were happy to get such a good deal on a beautiful property. Sarah never spoke publicly about what happened that night, but she became a regular at St. Catherine's, and Henry grew up as an altar server, a bright boy who showed no memory of how close he'd come to being taken. Thomas Garrett lived 5 more years, and on his deathbed, he told Father Marcus that he'd seen the creature one more time. Years after that night, standing at the edge of the forest, watching the town, he said it looked different in the daylight, smaller somehow, and for just a moment before it turned and disappeared into the trees, he could have sworn it looked like a man, just an ordinary man, though he couldn't make out the face. Marcus asked if Thomas thought it was truly gone, and the old hunter shook his head. He said that some things never really leave. Tehust wait patient as stone, for people to forget, for the old protections to lapse, for a new generation to decide that the warnings of their ancestors are nothing but superstition. And when that time comes, they emerge again, hungry, drawn to the vulnerable, to the unclaimed, to the unbaptized. Father Marcus kept the old records, added his own account to them, left instructions for his successor about what to do if the killings ever started again. He retired eventually, but he still lived in Mill, and every autumn when the nights grew long and the wind carried the scent of changing seasons, he would walk past the houses where children slept safe in their beds, marked by the ancient rite that had protected generations before them. He would see the woods beyond town, dark and deep and full of shadows, and he would remember that there are things older than the church, older than civilization, that move in those shadows still. And he would pray that the people of Millbrook would never forget why some traditions endure, why some rituals matter, why the old women whisper warnings that the young dismiss at their peril. Because in the Appalachian Hills, where the mountains hold memories and the forests keep secrets, some hungers never die. They only sleep, waiting for the scent of innocence unprotected, for the cry of a child unclaimed, for the moment when faith falters and ancient terrors can walk again under the moon.